It was just another ordinary afternoon at the city train station. People hurried through the wide hall, dragging their suitcases, checking the departure screens, or talking loudly on their phones. The sound of footsteps, rolling wheels, and distant announcements filled the air. Everyone seemed too busy to notice anything or anyone. Among the constant movement, there stood an old upright piano near a corner, slightly out of tune with a few scratches on its wooden frame. It was placed there years ago for anyone to play, but most days it sat silent, gathering dust as the world rushed past it. For a long time, no one paid attention to it. Travelers came and went, some glancing at it, others using it as a place to rest their coffee cups for a moment. But that day, something different was about to happen. Something quiet, simple, and yet powerful enough to stop hundreds of people in their tracks. A man walked in through the main entrance. He looked like he had been traveling for days. His jacket was worn, his shoes had seen better times, and his hair was slightly messy from the wind outside. He carried no luggage, no briefcase, just himself. He moved slowly, almost as if each step carried the weight of many memories. He wasn't the kind of person anyone would normally notice in a crowd like this. There was nothing loud or special about him. He seemed invisible in a place where everyone was too focused on their own journey. He paused near the piano. At first, it seemed like he was just resting. People walked by, barely noticing. But then he turned slightly and looked at the piano, not with curiosity, but with a strange sense of familiarity, like someone seeing an old friend after many years apart. His eyes softened as he took a deep breath. He reached out his hand and gently touched the top of the piano, brushing away a thin layer of dust. His fingers lingered there for a moment, as if remembering the feeling of smooth wood beneath them. A few people nearby noticed him now. A couple waiting for their train exchanged glances. A little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering that the man was going to play. But the man didn't rush. He stood quietly, taking in the sounds around him, the noise, the movement, the chaos, and then slowly pulled out the piano bench. The sound of it scraping lightly across the floor made a few heads turn. He sat down carefully, adjusting himself as if testing the weight of the seat. He placed his hands in his lap, looked down for a few seconds, and took another deep breath. There was a quiet stillness about him, something peaceful yet heavy. He looked like someone who had carried a story too long in silence and was finally ready to let it out, not through words, but through music. At first, no one expected much. People had seen others try to play that piano before. Most times it was a child hitting random keys or someone playing a few simple notes before leaving. But when his fingers finally rose and hovered above the keys, there was something different, something careful and deliberate. He didn't move right away. He waited, his eyes half closed, his shoulders relaxed as if listening to something only he could hear. Then he pressed a single key. It was a soft sound, almost lost in the noise of the station, but somehow it felt clear and pure. The tone lingered in the air longer than expected. He pressed another key and then another, forming a gentle melody. Within seconds, the busy sounds of the station seemed to fade into the background. Conversations paused mid-sentence. The rhythm of footsteps slowed. The music was not loud, but it carried emotion, something deep, something real. The melody grew note by note, shaping into something beautiful. His fingers began to move more confidently, flowing across the keys with precision and care. Each movement seemed effortless, but it carried the weight of years of practice, of love, and maybe loss. People began to notice. A woman who had been scrolling on her phone stopped and looked up. A security guard leaned slightly forward from his post. Even the announcements echoing across the hall seemed to grow quieter, as if the station itself was listening. The man didn't look around. He wasn't playing for attention. His eyes were closed now, his face calm but full of quiet emotion. His hands moved like they remembered something his heart could never forget. The melody was soft at first, almost like a whisper. Then it grew stronger, weaving between tenderness and sorrow. There was something about the way he played that felt personal, as if every note carried a memory too precious to speak aloud. A small group began to gather near the piano. Some stood still, holding their bags. Others slowly approached, drawn by the sound they couldn't ignore. The man remained unaware. His focus was complete, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm, his fingers gliding effortlessly across black and white keys. It was as though the world around him had disappeared, leaving only him and the music. Nothing else. A few children sat on the floor to listen. One man took out his phone to record, holding it up carefully so as not to disturb the moment. The camera captured the calm expression of the pianist, the slight movements of his fingers, and the way light from the glass roof above shimmered softly over the piano's surface. The melody rose higher, like a story reaching its most emotional point, and then fell again into quiet reflection. People didn't know who he was. He didn't seem like a performer. There was no sign or introduction. But as he continued to play, something inside everyone who listened began to stir. A feeling of connection. The music seemed to speak of things words couldn't describe. Loneliness, beauty, forgiveness, hope. It was the kind of sound that made people remember moments they thought they had forgotten. The man's expression changed slightly as he played on. A faint smile appeared, not a showy one, but soft and genuine, like someone finally finding peace after a long storm. He played with both strength and fragility, like someone who knew what it felt like to lose something dear and to keep going anyway. It wasn't just music. It was emotion turned into sound. After several minutes, the melody shifted again, becoming slower, almost like a conversation between his hands and the piano. Each note was clear and filled with meaning. The audience had grown now, dozens of people standing silently, watching him with awe. Even those rushing for their train slowed down or stopped completely. The station that was always full of noise had turned strangely quiet, as if the music had taken control of time itself. The man didn't look proud or nervous. He looked free. Every motion of his hands was graceful, natural, like breathing. When his fingers reached the final notes of the piece, there was a long pause before he let his hands fall to his lap. The music faded gently, leaving behind an almost sacred silence. For a few seconds, no one moved. It felt as though everyone was afraid to break the spell. Then, slowly, the sound of life returned. The faint echo of footsteps, a distant cough, the hum of the building. But for that one brief moment, an entire train station had fallen completely silent for a stranger who simply sat down and played. No one knew his story yet, but everyone could feel that there was one, something hidden behind his calm face and tired eyes. The man stayed there for a few seconds longer, breathing quietly. He looked down at the keys, brushing his fingers lightly over them one last time, almost as if saying goodbye. Then he stood up, adjusted his jacket, and stepped away. A few people tried to speak to him, but he simply smiled politely and walked toward the exit. His footsteps were slow but steady. Behind him, the piano sat quietly again, still carrying the warmth of the music that had filled the air just moments earlier. The crowd began to disperse, but the feeling remained. That strange sense of peace and wonder that music can bring when it touches something deep inside. Later, people would replay the video clips they had recorded, showing a man no one knew sitting at a dusty piano, playing as if he carried the world inside his heart. No one could have guessed what his story was or why he had chosen that moment, that place to let his music speak. But one thing was certain. That afternoon, in a place full of strangers, a hidden pianist reminded everyone what silence really sounds like after something truly beautiful. The sound of his final note still seemed to float in the air long after he walked away. People stood there for a few moments, unsure what to do. Some clapped softly, but most just looked around at each other, almost embarrassed by how deeply they had been moved by a stranger. The train station, which just minutes ago was filled with noise and rushing footsteps, felt different now. It was as if something invisible had passed through, quiet but powerful. A young woman held her phone close, looking at the recording she had made. She replayed it once, and the sound came through her small speaker, soft, emotional, exactly as it had felt in person. People near her leaned in to listen again. Someone else nearby had recorded too, and soon others were doing the same, sharing it online within minutes. But at that moment in the station, everyone still felt like they had witnessed something private, something that didn't belong to the digital world just yet. The piano sat there quietly, its keys still warm. A child went near it and touched one of them, pressing a random note that broke the silence. His mother smiled and gently pulled him back, whispering something about respecting the man's music. A few others looked in the direction where the pianist had walked, but he was already gone, swallowed by the crowd, just another figure moving between people with suitcases and tickets in hand. Outside the station, the sky had turned a dull shade of orange. The man walked slowly toward the exit, his hands in his pockets, the wind brushing against his jacket. He didn't look back. He didn't know people were already talking about him. Didn't know that within an hour, clips of his performance would start spreading like wildfire online. For him, it had just been a moment to breathe, to let something out that had been buried deep for too long. Back inside, more people had gathered around the piano. Some sat on the benches nearby, waiting to see if someone else would play. One man, holding his phone, was already uploading his video, adding a caption that read, "This man just stopped the whole station with his music." He didn't know who the pianist was, but he felt that people needed to hear it. Within a few hours, the video started to get attention online. At first, it was shared among local groups, people commenting things like, "I saw this live," or "Does anyone know who he is?" Others said they had been moved to tears by the way he played. Some guessed that he must have been a professional pianist once. Others thought he might be homeless or a traveler with a gift. Nobody really knew, but everyone agreed on one thing. The music had a kind of emotion that didn't feel like performance. It felt like truth. As evening came, the station returned to its usual rhythm. Trains arrived and left, announcements echoed again, and the crowd went back to its normal noise. But every once in a while, someone would stop at the piano, sit down and try to play a few notes, as if hoping to bring back the feeling that man had created earlier. None of them could, of course. The sound wasn't just in the music, it was in the person who played it. Meanwhile, the man had found a quiet cafe a few streets away. He sat near the window, ordered a small cup of tea, and stared outside. The sound of rain began to tap lightly against the glass. He seemed lost in thought, his hands wrapped around the warm cup, his fingers slightly trembling. Not from the cold, but from emotion. Playing again after so many years had stirred something deep inside him. He had not planned it. It had just happened, as if his heart had guided him there without asking. The waitress came by, smiling softly as she placed a napkin beside his cup. She had recognized him. She had been in the station earlier during her break and had seen the entire thing. She wanted to ask him if he was the same man, but she stopped herself. There was something private about the way he sat, peaceful but distant, like someone carrying both sorrow and acceptance. So she just smiled and walked away, leaving him to his thoughts. He sat there for a long time, staring at his reflection in the window. He thought about how long it had been since he last touched a piano. The years had passed quietly. Life had taken unexpected turns, ones that had pulled him away from the music he once lived for. There had been losses, disappointments, things too painful to revisit. Music had always been his language, his way to speak when words failed. But for years he had stayed silent. Now, after just a few minutes at an old public piano, he felt something inside him change. It wasn't about fame or applause. It was about remembering who he truly was beneath everything else. For the first time in a long while, he felt light. Hours later, when he finally left the cafe, the rain had stopped. The streets were wet and reflected the glow of passing cars. He walked slowly, his head slightly bowed, disappearing again into the city. Another stranger among millions. The next morning, things began to change. By sunrise, his video had been viewed thousands of times. People were commenting endlessly, trying to find out who he was. Someone recognized the melody he played, an old piece written by a forgotten composer, performed once decades ago in a famous concert hall. A few older listeners claimed they remembered a man who had played like that before, a pianist who had once been known in smaller circles, then disappeared after personal tragedy. As the story spread, journalists began looking into it. They wanted to know the identity of the hidden pianist. Local news stations played the clip, showing the man sitting calmly in the middle of a crowded station, his hands moving gracefully over the keys while the world around him stood still. It was simple footage, shaky and raw, but the emotion it carried didn't need editing. It was real and people could feel it. Comments flooded in from around the world, people saying his music had touched them, reminding them of lost dreams, of beauty in small moments. Some said they had cried listening to it. Others said it gave them peace. No one knew his name, but everyone felt like they had met his soul through his playing. Back at the station, a small note appeared taped to the piano. "To the pianist who played yesterday, thank you for reminding us to feel." Over the next few days, flowers began to appear near the piano. Some people left little thank you notes. Others left drawings or poems. The piano, once ignored, had become something special, a symbol of the beauty that could appear without warning in the middle of ordinary life. The station staff noticed the change too. They started cleaning around the piano more often, even tuning it slightly so that anyone who played could add something new to the space. But still, everyone hoped he would return. Every day someone asked, "Do you think he'll come back?" The man didn't know about all this. He didn't use social media. He didn't follow the news. He spent most of his days quietly, walking through the city, thinking, remembering. Sometimes he stopped near music stores, looking through the windows at instruments he could no longer afford. He would smile faintly, then move on. Music had always been his way of speaking to the world, and though the world was now trying to speak back to him, he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. He had lived too long in silence to suddenly step back into the noise. But deep down he felt something changing. He could feel it in the way people had listened, in the way silence had filled that room after his last note. Maybe, he thought, the world hadn't forgotten about music after all. Maybe it just needed to be reminded. As evening fell again, the same piano sat waiting at the corner of the station. People walked past, but every now and then someone would glance at it, hoping. The faint echo of that melody still seemed to linger, like a memory that refused to fade. The hidden pianist had played only once, but somehow that single moment had stayed alive, in recordings and hearts, in the quiet corners of a busy city. Some stories don't need an ending right away. Some are meant to unfold slowly, carried by those who witnessed them, and though no one yet knew where the man had gone or whether he would ever return, the music he left behind had already done something extraordinary. It had reminded people that even in the noisiest places, silence can still mean something beautiful when it follows the sound of truth. Days passed, but the memory of the man at the piano didn't fade. The video of his performance had spread far beyond the city now. It appeared on news feeds, music blogs, and morning talk shows. People called him the hidden pianist, the man who made a station fall silent, and even the soul player. Every outlet wanted to know who he was. Reporters visited the train station, asking staff and bystanders if they knew anything about him. Most had only seen him for a few minutes and no one knew his name. Yet even without knowing him, people felt connected to him. They spoke about the way he played, not just how skilled he was, but how deeply he seemed to feel each note. Many said they hadn't heard music like that in years, music that reached beyond technique and touched the heart directly. Others shared stories about how his playing had inspired them to return to old passions, painting, writing, or simply listening to music again. At the piano itself, more letters kept appearing. Someone had placed a small framed photo of the piano taken during the performance, surrounded by short messages written by strangers. One read, "You reminded me that beauty still exists." Another said, "Whoever you are, thank you for your honesty." It was as if the city had adopted him without even knowing his name. Meanwhile, the man continued his quiet life. Each morning he woke early and walked through the same streets, stopping sometimes near the park where people fed pigeons or by a small bookstore that played classical music softly from a speaker above the door. He rarely went inside anywhere. He lived simply with few belongings and spoke to almost no one. The piano at the station had been a moment of release, not a plan. He didn't know that moment had already started to change his life. One afternoon, while he was walking near a small square, he noticed a man with a camera filming something. The camera pointed at a phone showing a video of him playing in the station. The cameraman was speaking to a reporter saying, "This video has over 2 million views already. We're still trying to find out who he is." The man paused for a second, listening. It felt strange hearing people talk about him while standing right there unseen. He turned quietly and walked away, not wanting attention, not ready for it. But the world, as it often does, kept searching. Someone online noticed that the melody he played wasn't random. It was a rare piece, one that hadn't been performed publicly in many years. After comparing recordings, a few music enthusiasts began to suspect that the pianist might once have been a well-known musician who had disappeared from the stage years ago. They shared old photos and video clips side by side with the new footage from the station. The resemblance was undeniable. A name began to circulate online, a name many had forgotten, The man had once performed in concert halls across Europe. He was known for his emotional style, for playing not from the sheet but from the heart. Years ago, after a personal loss, he had canceled his tours and vanished from public life. No one knew what had happened to him after that. The discovery spread quickly. Within hours, music forums and news sites were filled with comparisons, interviews with people who had known him, and messages of admiration. People spoke about how tragedy had silenced him, and how fate had somehow led him to that station piano years later. Some said it was destiny. Others called it a miracle. He didn't know any of this yet. He spent most of his days in quiet places, reading, walking, or sitting by the river. One evening, he passed by a cafe where a television was playing, and the familiar sound of a piano came from inside. He froze. On the screen was his own face, the video of him at the station being replayed on a news segment. The caption at the bottom read, "The hidden pianist's identity revealed after years of silence." He stood outside for a long time, listening to the broadcast through the window. They were talking about him, about his past, about the loss he had suffered, about the concerts that had once filled halls with applause. He watched silently, his expression unreadable. When the report ended, he turned away and continued walking, his reflection vanishing into the dim light of the street. The next day, things changed again. People began recognizing him on the streets. Some stopped him to thank him. Others just smiled knowingly. A few even asked if he would play again. He responded kindly but softly, always with the same answer. Not today. He didn't crave the spotlight, and he wasn't looking for a comeback. The music he had played that day wasn't meant to impress anyone. It had simply come from a place of truth inside him. Still, the world wanted more. Invitations began arriving. Emails, letters, even handwritten notes left at the train station. Orchestras wanted him to return. Music schools asked if he would teach. A famous hall offered him a concert night to mark his return to the world. But he stayed quiet. He didn't reply to any of them. He visited the station again a few days later, just as the sun was setting. The place looked the same, yet different. There were still travelers rushing to catch their trains, but now, many stopped to look at the piano as they passed. Some even took pictures of it. A small group of people were sitting nearby, talking softly about the day he had played there. He walked closer, unnoticed at first. The flowers left beside the piano had dried slightly, but they still carried color. He sat on a nearby bench and watched as a young boy, no older than 12, climbed onto the piano bench and began to play. The boy's hands moved clumsily, missing notes, but his effort was sincere. The man smiled. It reminded him of his younger self, the same uncertainty, the same spark of curiosity. When the boy finished, the man quietly approached. The boy looked up, startled. "You play beautifully," the man said softly. The boy smiled shyly and said, "I'm just learning." The man nodded. "Keep playing," he said, "even when no one is listening. That's when it matters most." The boy didn't realize who he was speaking to, and the man didn't explain. He simply patted the piano gently, as if greeting an old friend, and walked away once more. The crowd nearby watched, some whispering that it was really him, though none dared to stop him. That night, back in his small room, he thought about everything that had happened. The quiet life he had built for himself was now surrounded by noise again. Cameras, questions, expectations. He didn't want fame, but he couldn't deny that the world seemed to need what he had given them. A moment of peace. A reminder of something real. He closed his eyes and remembered the feeling of his fingers on the keys, the sound of that first note echoing through the station, and the silence that followed. It had been pure, not planned, not rehearsed, just honest. Maybe that was what people had really heard, honesty in a world that rarely stopped long enough to listen. In the following days, more letters arrived. Some were from people who had been struggling with loss or loneliness, saying that his music had given them comfort. Others were from young musicians thanking him for reminding them why they started playing in the first place. He read each one slowly, often with tears in his eyes. He realized that maybe he hadn't played that day just for himself. Maybe, without knowing it, he had played for everyone who needed to remember what hope sounded like. The city continued to buzz around him, but inside, something had changed. He began visiting the piano more often, not every day and not to perform. Sometimes he just sat there, resting his hands on the keys without pressing them, Other times he would play a few quiet melodies, short and unrecorded, for whoever happened to be passing by. He never stayed long, and he always left quietly, blending back into the crowd. People still filmed him when they could, still shared his new clips online, but for him, it wasn't about attention anymore. It was about healing, about giving back what music had given him. Each note became a conversation between him and the world, a gentle reminder that art, at its heart, is not about fame or applause but about connection, and so, the man who had once hidden himself from the world began to return to it, not with grand performances or interviews, but through small, quiet moments that carried more power than any stage ever could. He remained a mystery to most, a stranger whose music could stop time for just a few minutes. But for those who listened, he became something far greater, proof that beauty can rise again even from silence. The following weeks brought a strange kind of calm to his life. The world still spoke about him, yet he lived quietly, almost untouched by all the noise. Every day the piano at the station drew visitors, travelers, students, tourists, even families who had seen the video and wanted to feel the moment for themselves. Some came hoping to see him again. Others came just to listen, hoping someone else might play something that carried even a trace of the magic he had left behind. For the man himself, those days were peaceful, but uncertain. He still avoided crowds, still walked the streets with his head low, but something had begun to stir inside him, a quiet pull toward the music he had abandoned long ago. It was as if the piano had opened a door he had once locked and left behind. He found himself thinking about melodies while walking, tapping rhythms on his knee while sitting by the river. The silence he had lived in for years no longer felt like peace. It felt like waiting. One morning, as he sat on a park bench feeding a few birds, an old man approached him slowly. He was dressed neatly, carrying a cane and wearing a kind smile. The man recognized him right away. "I've been looking for you," the older gentleman said softly. He introduced himself as the manager of a nearby music conservatory. He explained that he had once attended one of the Pianist performances many years ago, and it had stayed with him ever since. "I saw the video," he said. "You played like someone who had nothing left to prove, only something to share." The pianist listened quietly. The old man continued, "We're holding a charity concert next month. It's for children who can't afford music lessons. I thought, maybe you'd consider performing." "Just one song." The man looked down at his hands. His first instinct was to say no. He hadn't played in front of an audience for so long. The idea frightened him, not because of nerves, but because of what it might awaken inside him. For years he had buried that part of himself, the performer, the dreamer. Bringing it back felt like opening an old wound, but the older man didn't press. He simply placed a small card on the bench beside him and said, "Think about it. Sometimes the world needs to hear what we've kept silent." Then he walked away, leaving the pianist alone with his thoughts and the sound of distant city life around him. For days, he kept the card tucked inside his coat pocket. He tried not to think about it, but it kept returning to his mind. The faces of those children he might help. The feeling of playing again, not for fame, but for purpose. Late one night, he found himself walking back to the train station. It was quiet at that hour, nearly empty except for a few cleaners and travelers waiting for late trains. He sat down at the same piano once more. The familiar feel of the keys beneath his fingers brought a rush of emotion. He played softly, not a full song, just fragments, pieces of melodies he used to know. The sound filled the empty hall like a whisper from the past. His heart felt heavy but alive. When he finally stopped, he smiled to himself, a small, honest smile. The next day, he returned to the conservatory and agreed to play. The news spread quickly. Posters went up around the city, an evening of hope, featuring the return of the hidden pianist. The concert wasn't meant to be a grand comeback. It was for charity, for children, and that made it feel right. Still, people everywhere were eager to see him. The story had touched so many that tickets sold out within hours. As the date grew closer, he spent more time practicing alone in one of the conservatory's quiet rooms. The first few days were difficult, his fingers stiff, his timing uneven. But slowly, the old rhythm returned. The more he played, the more the years seemed to melt away. The pain that had once silenced him began to transform into something else, something beautiful. He decided to play the same piece he had performed in the station that day. It felt right, like completing a circle. But this time, he wanted to add something more. A few new notes, softer transitions, little pieces of his own story hidden between the familiar chords. The night of the concert arrived. The hall was filled with people, families, musicians, reporters, and children sitting wide-eyed in the front row. The air buzzed with quiet excitement. Backstage, the man sat alone, his hands folded on his lap. He could hear the low hum of the audience beyond the curtain. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. He wondered if he could still move them, still reach them the way he once had. But then he remembered that day in the station, how the music had come to him naturally, without thought, without fear. He realized he didn't have to perform tonight. He just had to feel. When he stepped onto the stage, the room fell completely silent. The lights were warm, soft, not too bright. He walked slowly to the piano, bowed slightly, and sat down. His hands hovered above the keys for a few seconds as he took a deep breath. Then he began to play. The first note rang out clear and gentle, just as it had that day in the station. The hall seemed to breathe with him, every sound, every pause carrying meaning. His fingers moved with grace, painting emotion into the air. The melody built slowly, like a conversation between the past and the present. People in the audience leaned forward, caught in the moment. As the song deepened, memories filled his mind. His younger days on stage, the applause, the long nights of practice, and then the moment he lost everything that once mattered. But instead of pain, he felt peace. The notes flowed like forgiveness, why, not just for others, but for himself. When the final section came, he played it softer than ever before. The sound was fragile, tender, like a heartbeat. As he pressed the last key, he let it linger, holding it just long enough to let the silence that followed become part of the music itself. The hall was still. Nobody clapped right away. There was that same silence he had once felt in the station, heavy, sacred, full of feeling. Then slowly the applause began. It grew louder and louder until it filled the entire room. People stood, cheering, crying, smiling. But the man didn't bask in it. He simply looked out at them and bowed his head humbly. Backstage, after the performance, children from the conservatory came running up to him. They thanked him, some with tears in their eyes. One small girl handed him a drawing she had made of a piano surrounded by stars. "This is how your music felt," she said softly. The man smiled, taking the picture carefully as though it were made of glass. Later that night, when everyone had left and the lights of the hall were dimmed, he sat at the piano again, alone. The echoes of applause were still fading in the distance. He placed the little girl's drawing on the piano and began to play once more, quietly, just for himself. The music filled the empty hall like a whisper between old friends. For the first time in years, he didn't feel hidden. He didn't feel lost. He felt whole. The piano wasn't just an instrument anymore, and it was his voice, his companion, his bridge back to the world. Outside, the city was quiet. A soft wind moved through the streets, carrying the faint echo of his final melody. Somewhere in the distance, a train passed, its sound blending with the night. People who had attended the concert walked home in silence, each carrying something they couldn't quite describe. A feeling, a memory, a spark of hope. And the man, sitting in the empty hall, closed his eyes and smiled. After years of silence, he had found what he didn't know he was searching for. Not fame, not recognition, but connection. The understanding that even one small act of truth, like sitting down at a forgotten piano, could ripple outward and change countless lives. He stayed there until the early hours of the morning, playing soft melodies that only the walls could hear. Each note seemed to thank the world for listening, and the silence between them thanked him for returning. That night, the hidden pianist was hidden no more. Weeks passed after the concert, but the memory of that night refused to fade. People who had been there still spoke about it with wonder, not because it was flawless, but because it felt real. The way the man had played, the quiet strength in his touch, the story written in each note. It had touched something deep inside them. For many, it wasn't just music. It was a reminder that even the quietest souls could leave the loudest echoes. The video of the concert spread quickly online. It wasn't flashy or edited with effects. It was raw, captured by someone sitting in the back row. Yet that simplicity made it even more powerful. Viewers around the world shared it, leaving comments about how the performance had made them cry, think, or remember something they'd lost. It reached places the pianist would never know and hearts he would never meet. But for him, life returned to quietness. The morning after the concert, he walked through the city as usual, blending into the crowd like a shadow. He still preferred simplicity, a small rented room, long walks by the river, evenings spent near his piano. Fame had never been his goal. It had always been the music itself. Yet something was different now. Wherever he went, people greeted him with warmth. Some stopped him to say thank you. Others simply nodded as if recognizing something kind in him. It wasn't fame that followed him. It was respect. One afternoon, as he walked through the park, he saw a small group of children gathered around a street musician. The young man playing the guitar wasn't particularly skilled, but his heart was in every note. The children clapped and laughed. Watching them, the pianist felt something stir inside, a quiet realization that music was meant to be shared, not hidden. That night, he returned to the conservatory and asked if he could volunteer to teach. The director smiled, clearly moved. "We'd be honored," he said simply. From then on, the man spent his mornings teaching children who couldn't afford lessons. He didn't teach them to be perfect. He taught them to listen, to themselves, to others, to the world. Music isn't just sound, he often told them. It's feeling. If you play with feeling, even one note can touch a heart. The children loved him. They said he spoke like someone who understood them completely. He wasn't strict or distant. He was gentle, patient, and full of quiet humor. Some of them didn't even know who he truly was. The man from the video, the hidden pianist. They just knew he made the piano come alive. Every now and then he returned to the train station, sitting quietly at the old piano. It had become something of a landmark now. Tourists took photos with it. Musicians came to play their hearts out. But when he sat there, the noise of the world seemed to fade away again. The piano, worn and slightly out of tune, still held the same warmth. He played softly without an audience, letting the sound flow through the empty hallways like a secret conversation. People who happened to pass by sometimes stopped, unsure at first who was playing. They would listen, drawn in by the gentleness of the sound. Some recorded short clips, unaware they were capturing the man who had once brought the world to silence. But he didn't mind. He didn't need to be recognized anymore. It was enough to know that his music still reached people, even in small moments. Months later, the conservatory decided to host another charity concert, this time featuring his students. He helped them prepare, guiding them through every piece, teaching them to breathe with the music. When the day came, he sat backstage watching them perform one by one. Each child played with such heart that the audience couldn't help but smile. He didn't go on stage that night. He didn't need to. The music had already gone where it needed to, into new hands, new lives. After the concert ended, one of the students, a quiet boy who had struggled the most at first, came up to him holding a small notebook. "I wrote something," the boy said shyly. "It's for you." The man opened it and found a short message inside. "You taught me how to listen to silence." Those words stayed with him for a long time. Years passed gently. The pianist continued to teach, to play quietly in the corners of the city and to live simply. He never sought recognition, never returned to the grand stages he had once known. But his influence spread quietly through the lives he touched. Some of his students became musicians, others didn't, but they carried the lessons of patience, emotion, and truth into whatever they did. There was one student in particular, a young girl who had been very shy at first, afraid even to touch the keys. He spent months helping her find her courage. When she finally performed for the first time, her hands trembled, but she played beautifully. Years later, she would become a pianist herself, performing around the world. Every time she stepped on stage, she would think of the man who had taught her that music wasn't about being seen. It was about being felt. By then, the hidden pianist had grown older. His hair had turned silver, his steps slower, but his eyes still carried the same calm light. He often sat by his window in the evenings, watching the sun fade behind the city skyline. Sometimes he'd close his eyes and imagine the sounds of the station, the footsteps, the announcements, the faint rumble of trains beneath his melody. He could still feel that moment, the hush that fell when he first played, and the silence that spoke louder than any applause.